Hit the like button, share your thoughts, subscribe, and tap the bell icon. In the distant future, the galaxy was a vast and diverse place, home to thousands of alien species. Among them were the Zinther, a species known for their advanced intellect, superior physical strength, and cold, calculating nature. They ruled much of the galaxy with an iron grip, manipulating lesser races for their own gain. Their empire spanned across star systems, bending countless civilizations to their will. The Zinther had long viewed humans as a primitive and insignificant race, barely worth their attention, except as tools to further their own goals. But that was before everything changed. Her name was Zalara, a high-ranking officer within the Zinther Empire. Zalara had always been proud of her heritage, of her strength and status among her people. She had been taught that the Zinther were superior to all, destined to dominate the galaxy. She believed in the old ways, where the Zinther held sway over other species with an almost divine right. However, her outlook began to shift after a pivotal mission on a distant human colony world. Zalara's assignment had seemed straightforward at first, a simple task of asserting control over a human settlement that had been deemed a strategic location by the Zinther military. The colony was thriving, growing rapidly, and its resources were rich in minerals the Zinther coveted. Perfect prize for the Empire. Upon arrival, Zalara had expected resistance, as was typical of lesser species, but she was shocked to find the humans fighting with an intensity she had never encountered before. Their spirit was unlike anything she had ever seen. They were not as physically strong or technologically advanced as the Zinther, but their determination, creativity, and resilience were unmatched. They fought not just for survival, but for their very way of life. It was during this mission that Zalara first met Dorian, a human commander who led the colony's resistance efforts. He was nothing like the Zinther, yet in his eyes, she saw a fire that burned with the same intensity as her own. Over the course of their encounters, Zalara began to feel a strange attraction to him, an emotion that was as alien to her as the concept of mercy. Her people had no place for weakness, no room for empathy. Yet, in Dorian's presence, she felt something stir within her, something that went against everything she had been taught. But it wasn't just Dorian that intrigued her. It was the humans as a whole. Their capacity for growth, for innovation, for unyielding hope. It made her question everything she had ever known about the Zinther superiority. Were they truly the greatest species in the galaxy? Or were they just another empire doomed to fall, consumed by their arrogance? Her mission was a failure. The humans, under Dorian's leadership, had managed to outsmart her forces, forcing her to retreat. It was a humiliating defeat, one that Zalara had never experienced before. The taste of defeat was bitter, but it was also a catalyst for change. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside her, something deep and profound. Upon returning to Zinther space, she found herself isolated from her peers. They saw her failure as a weakness, and in the rigid caste system of the Zinther, weakness was not tolerated. Her once proud reputation crumbled, and she was shunned by those who had once respected her. But Zalara no longer cared. She no longer believed in the Zinther's supremacy, and she was no longer bound by their rules. In the quiet solitude of her quarters, Zalara began to plot her revenge, not against the humans, but against her own race. The Zinther, she realized, were a dying species. Their arrogance had made them blind to the true strength that lay in diversity, in unity, and in the very human spirit they had so long underestimated. She would take revenge on the Zinther by mating exclusively with humans, ensuring that her bloodline would carry on the legacy of their resilience, creativity, and determination. Zalara's decision was bold, reckless, and unheard of in Zinther culture. It was an act of defiance against everything her people stood for. But in her heart, she knew it was the only way to show the galaxy that the Zinther were not the only ones capable of greatness. The humans, with their boundless potential, would be the ones to rise, while the Zinther would fade into obscurity. And so, Zalara's journey began not as a conqueror, but as a revolutionary. She would break free from her people's chains and forge a new path, one that would forever change the fate of the galaxy. As she stood before the holographic image of Dorian, Her mind was made up. She would unite with him, and with every human she encountered, to create a legacy of strength that the Zinther could never match. Her revenge would be the creation of a new order, a future where humanity would stand at the top, and the Zinther would be nothing more than a forgotten memory. Zalara's departure from the Zinther Empire was not a quiet one. She had been a warrior, a respected officer, a daughter of the Empire. But now she was a fugitive, cast out for her failure and her audacious ideas. As she fled the Empire's core worlds, she took nothing with her but the raw conviction that her revenge, her plan, was the only future worth fighting for. Her first stop was a desolate border world, one where the Zinther had little interest. Here, she could lie low, hiding from both her former allies and the Empire's ever-watchful eyes. It was a world populated by all sorts of outcasts and refugees, people from various races who had fallen through the cracks of the galaxy. It was perfect for what she needed. Zalara's once glorious armor was discarded, replaced by a simple cloak and a hood. She blended in, moving through the streets unnoticed, but every step she took felt heavy. This was the price of her rebellion, the price of defying everything she had once believed. She took refuge in the city's underbelly, an area known for its unsavory dealings and black market trade. It was here that she made contact with the one person who could help her, Dorian. He had been tracking her since her defeat, intrigued by the woman who had once been his enemy. Zalara had made sure their paths would cross again, and she had carefully orchestrated the meeting. The humans had their ways, and Dorian, with his strategic brilliance, was a force she could not ignore. They met in a dimly lit cantina, the air thick with smoke and the hum of alien languages. Dorian was everything she remembered, tall, strong, with an intensity in his eyes that mirrored her own. Yet, there was something new in his gaze now, something that spoke of respect and perhaps even a budding understanding of the woman she had become. He was no longer just a commander of a resistance. He was a symbol of humanity's fight for survival and freedom. "You've come a long way, Zalara," Dorian said, his voice low but steady. "I never thought I'd see the day when a Zinther would turn her back on her people." Zalara's eyes narrowed. "I never thought I'd see the day when a human would be the one to make me question everything I've been taught," she replied. Dorian leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "So what now? You've turned your back on the Empire. What's your plan?" Zalara hesitated for only a moment before she spoke. "I'm going to ensure that my bloodline carries the strength of your people. Mate with humans, only humans, and ensure that the Zinther never dominate the galaxy again." The words hung in the air between them, both bold and dangerous. Dorian's brow furrowed, but he did not flinch. "You understand what this means, don't you? The Zinther won't take kindly to your betrayal. They'll hunt you down." Zalara's lips curled into a faint smile, one that held both defiance and resolve. "I don't fear them anymore. Let them come. I will build something that they can never destroy." Dorian studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He had come to admire the Zinther officer during their previous encounters, even as an enemy. He knew that this wasn't a decision made lightly. She was a warrior, one who had embraced the full weight of her rebellion. But it was also clear that Zalara was not just running away from the Zinther. She was running toward something greater, a vision that transcended the old rivalries and divisions of the galaxy. "You'll need more than just me," Dorian said finally. "You'll need allies. Humans who will help you, who will fight with you." Zalara nodded. "I know, but I don't just want allies. I want a future. A future where humans and Zinther are no longer at odds. Where we stand together." Dorian's lips twitched slightly. It was the first time she had spoken with such vulnerability, and for a moment, he could see the weight of her decision pressing down on her. It wasn't just a strategic choice. It was an emotional one that challenged everything she had ever known. It was an act of love as much as it was an act of defiance. "I'll help you," he said, "but you have to understand, this won't be easy. There are still factions within the Zinther who will stop at nothing to destroy you." Zalara met his gaze. "I'm not afraid of them. Then we'll need to move quickly. We'll start by gathering those who are willing to follow your cause, humans, and maybe even some who were once enemies. The alliance was formed, born from a shared desire for revenge, for freedom, and for the future. It was a fragile union, but it was strong in its purpose. Zalara and Dorian spent the next several months traveling through the galaxy, spreading word of her rebellion. They found scattered pockets of resistance on distant planets, humans and other species alike who were tired of the Zinthar's iron-fisted rule. Some joined out of necessity, others out of admiration for Zalara's audacity. But all were united by a common cause, the overthrow of the Zinthar, and the promise of a new, diverse galaxy where the shackles of tyranny were broken. With each new ally, Zalara's bloodline grew stronger, and her revenge took shape. She mated with humans, soldiers, farmers, diplomats, anyone who had the courage to stand by her side. The legacy she sought to create was no longer just her own. It was the beginning of something much larger, something that would redefine the future of the galaxy. But the Zinthar were never far behind. As her new family began to take root, whispers of her rebellion spread through the Empire. The hunt for Zalara was about to begin in earnest. The Zinthar Empire was not known for its patience. Once the word of Zalara's betrayal spread through their ranks, they moved swiftly. The Empire had long relied on fear and sheer military might to maintain control, and the thought of one of their own turning against them was a threat to their very foundation. Zalara was no longer just a traitor. She had become a symbol of everything that could unravel the carefully constructed order of the Zinthar. The first wave of Zinthar pursuers arrived on a forgotten planet, one where Zalara and Dorian had set up their base of operations. They had chosen this world for its desolation, a place where the Empire's sensors could be easily fooled by its barren landscape. But even in the most remote corners of the galaxy, the Zinthar had their spies, and it didn't take long for their forces to discover Zalara's hideout. The first attack came without warning, a devastating ambush. Zalara had known it was coming eventually, but the brutality of the assault still shook her. Her camp was torn apart in an instant, the Zinthar's superior weaponry and relentless tactics overwhelming the hastily built defenses. The humans and refugees who had joined her cause fought valiantly, but there was no denying the difference in scale and power between them and the Zinthar war machines. Zalara fought side by side with her new allies, leading them with the same fierce determination that had once made her an unshakable force within the Zinthar military. She was no longer the officer who took orders. She was the one giving them. Each swing of her blade, each tactical maneuver, was a message to the invaders. She was not going down without a fight. But despite their best efforts, the humans were outmatched. Dorian, standing beside her in the heat of battle, saw the inevitability of the situation. "We can't hold them off forever," he said, voice grim. "We need to retreat. Now." Zalara's eyes were aflame with resolve. "We'll fight to the last. We can't let them crush us before we've even begun." But Dorian shook his head. "If we stay, we die. If we retreat, we live to fight another day. The Zinthar want you, Zalara. They'll stop at nothing to destroy you. But they won't expect us to fight back as we should." Zalara hesitated. The thought of retreating felt like surrender, like admitting defeat. But she knew Dorian was right. If they stayed and were wiped out, their cause would be lost before it even began. They had to escape. "Move!" Zalara shouted, rallying her forces. "Take what you can and get to the ships. We won't let them win." With the remaining fighters, they made their way to the underground tunnels that led to a hidden launch site. It was a desperate maneuver, and as Zalara led her people through the shadows, she felt the weight of her decision. This wasn't the battle she had hoped for, but it was far from the end. The Zinthar forces followed, but Zalara's group managed to escape just in time, launching their ships into the stars as the first wave of destruction rained down on the planet. From the relative safety of their ships, they watched the planet burn, knowing the Zinthar would leave nothing behind but ash and ruins. For days, they drifted in space, making small jumps from one hidden base to another. The threat of discovery loomed over them like a shadow, and every moment was a gamble. Zalara's resolve never wavered, but doubt crept into her thoughts. Could they survive this? Could they truly overthrow the Zinthar Empire? a force that had dominated the galaxy for centuries? But then came the unexpected. Alliances with other rebel factions began to take shape. Across the galaxy, there were whispers of her cause, whispers of a Zinther defector who was giving hope to those who had long been oppressed. The humans who had rallied behind her were not the only ones ready to rise against the Zinther. Other species, some who had been subjugated by the Empire for generations, began to reach out. They saw Zalara as a figurehead of rebellion, a symbol of defiance that had not existed before. The first to answer the call was a group of former slaves, alien beings known as the Harnak, a species once enslaved by the Zinther for their immense strength. They had spent years mining in the deepest pits of Zinther-controlled planets, their lives reduced to nothing but toil. The Harnak were a brutal species, but they had an unbreakable spirit, and they were willing to fight for their freedom. Along with them came the Kavari, a race of brilliant engineers who had once been the Zinther's most trusted allies. But when the Zinther turned on them, exiling the Kavari for their growing autonomy, the Kavari had found themselves with nothing left but their skills and their hatred for their former masters. They brought with them ships and weapons, invaluable to Zalara's growing fleet. And then there were the humans. Dorian had proved to be an invaluable ally, but he wasn't alone. A network of resistance groups had sprung up on various planets, each one stronger and more organized than the last. They had learned from the initial setbacks and were now ready to strike back with everything they had. The rebels were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for victory. Zalara watched as her ragtag fleet grew, each new ship, each new ally, a step closer to her ultimate goal. She could feel the momentum building, the tide of history beginning to turn. But the Zinther were no fools. They had begun to adjust to the rebellion, sending larger fleets and more experienced generals after her. The conflict was escalating, and the stakes were higher than ever. As Zalara stood on the bridge of her flagship, gazing out at the vast expanse of stars before her, she knew that the coming battles would determine the future of the galaxy. The Zinther would not give up easily, but they had underestimated humanity and the strength of unity. The rebellion was no longer a small-scale insurgency. Zalara's defection had sparked a fire that was rapidly consuming the galaxy. Word of her cause spread like wildfire, crossing the void of space and touching even the most distant corners of the galaxy. The Zinther, once the undisputed rulers of the stars, were now facing an unprecedented challenge. Zalara had always known the fight would be difficult, but she had not anticipated the sheer scope of what they were up against. The Zinther Empire was vast, its military power nearly unrivaled. Yet, as the weeks passed, she could feel the tide beginning to shift. Every new alliance, every victory, no matter how small, chipped away at the Empire's dominance. The humans, the Harnak, the Kavari, and countless others were rising, their combined strength more than the Zinther had bargained for. But with this growing power came new challenges. The Zinther were no longer just sending soldiers. They were sending their best generals, their most ruthless commanders, and entire fleets to crush the rebellion. The stakes were higher, and the rebellion was now at war on a scale they hadn't yet experienced. The first major test came in the form of a Zinther fleet, larger and more powerful than any they had faced. The fleet was commanded by General Vither, a cunning strategist and Zalara's former mentor. He was one of the most respected officers in the Empire, a ruthless tactician who had taught Zalara everything she knew about warfare. Now he was hunting her down with the full might of the Empire. Zalara had known this day would come, the day when her past would catch up with her. General Vither was more than just a mentor to her. He was a symbol of everything she had once believed in. But now, standing on the opposite side of the battlefield, she could see him for what he truly was. An enforcer of tyranny, a man willing to destroy everything in his path for the sake of maintaining Zinther dominance. The battle took place in the nebula clouds of a distant system, where the shimmering gases obscured vision and interfered with sensors. It was the perfect place to ambush a fleet, and Zalara had been preparing for this moment. Her forces were spread thin, but they had something the Zinther did not, an unrelenting will to survive. As the two fleets faced off, Zalara stood on the bridge of her flagship, her eyes fixed on the holographic display in front of her. The Zinther fleet was massive, but she had an advantage. The rebels knew the nebula like the back of their hands. It was their home ground, and the Zinther were about to learn just how dangerous it could be. "Move into position," Zalara ordered, her voice steady. "We'll strike when they least expect it." The rebel fleet, made up of ships that were older and less advanced than the Zinthers, moved with surprising speed and agility. The nebula provided them with cover, hiding their movements from the Zinther's sensors. Zalara knew it was a gamble. If the Zinther managed to catch wind of their movements, the entire fleet would be decimated. But if they succeeded, it could deal a crippling blow to the Empire. The battle began with a burst of energy as the first wave of rebels emerged from the nebula, launching surprise attacks on the outermost Zinther ships. The Zinther fleet responded quickly, but their disorientation was evident. For the first time, they were the ones on the defensive, and it felt like a sweet victory for Zalara. She had always believed that a battle was not just won with strength, but with strategy, with the element of surprise. But General Vither was no fool. As the battle raged on, he quickly adapted to the changing situation. He began to anticipate Zalara's tactics, countering each move with precision. Despite the rebels' initial success, the Zinther fleet began to push back. The rebels were holding their ground, but they were losing precious ships. Zalara knew that they couldn't keep this up forever. Dorian's voice crackled over the comms. "Zalara, we need to fall back. We can't keep this up. They're too strong." Zalara clenched her fists. She hated the idea of retreating, hated the feeling of admitting they weren't strong enough. But she knew Dorian was right. They couldn't win this fight if they stayed in the open. "Fall back to the secondary position," she ordered. "Let them chase us. We'll turn the tide when the time is right." The rebels pulled back, using the nebula as their shield, luring the Zinther fleet deeper into the cloud of gas and debris. General Vither was relentless, pursuing them without hesitation, confident that the rebels had nowhere left to run. Then, just as Zalara had planned, they struck. The rebel fleet re-emerged from the nebula, this time flanking the Zinther ships. The surprise caught the Zinther off guard, and for the first time in the battle, they were on the back foot. Zalara's forces hammered at the Zinther fleet, using their agility and speed to outmaneuver their larger opponents. Rebel ships, despite being outclassed in firepower, fought with everything they had. In the heart of the battle, Zalara and General Vither finally came face to face. His flagship loomed large in front of hers, a symbol of everything she had once revered. She could feel the weight of their history together, the mentor, the student, now on opposite sides of a war. "You've become a traitor, Zalara," Vither's voice came through the comms, cold and unwavering. "You've turned your back on everything the Zinther Empire stands for. You've brought shame to your people." Zalara's response was equally steady, her voice carrying the force of her conviction. "The Zinther Empire has brought nothing but destruction to the galaxy. I've seen the truth now, and I will fight for a future where the people are free." For a moment, there was silence between them, an understanding of the weight of their words. Then, without another word, Zalara gave the order. "End this." The final push was swift, and General Vither's flagship was caught in the rebels' crossfire. His ship exploded in a brilliant burst of light, and with it Zalara's past. The battle raged on, but the loss of the general shattered the Zinther's morale. One by one, the Zinther ships began to fall, and the rebel fleet pressed on, unrelenting. When the battle was over, the nebula was quiet once more, but the victory was undeniable. Zalara stood on the bridge of her ship, her heart pounding with the rush of triumph. They had done it. The Zinther had been dealt a devastating blow. But Zalara knew this was only the beginning. There was still much to be done. The galaxy had not yet tasted the true power of the rebellion, and she would not rest until the Zinther were brought to their knees. The victory in the nebula marked a turning point. News of the Zinther fleet's defeat spread across the galaxy, fueling the fires of rebellion. In the wake of General Vither's death, many former Zinther allies reconsidered their allegiance, and former enemies found common ground. The galaxy was not as united as the Zinther had once thought. The cracks in their empire were deepening, and Zalara could feel it. However, the victory also marked the beginning of a new chapter in the war. The Zinther would not simply fade into obscurity. They would retaliate with fury, and Zalara knew that the rebellion had to be ready for what was to come. Her forces had grown, but they were still far from an even match for the Zinther's power. The rebels had proven themselves in battle, but the war was only just beginning. As Zalara stood on the bridge of her flagship, overlooking the star-strewn expanse of space, she could feel the weight of the responsibility she carried. Her people, human and alien alike, looked to her for guidance, for leadership. They had placed their trust in her, and she could not afford to fail them. "We've won a battle, but the war is far from over," she said, addressing the officers and leaders gathered in the briefing room. The atmosphere was heavy with the gravity of the situation, the pride of victory tempered by the knowledge of the challenges ahead. Dorian, ever at her side, nodded in agreement. "The Zinther are wounded, but they won't let this go. Their retaliation will come soon, and it will be swift. We need to be ready." Zalara's mind raced. The victory had given them a much-needed morale boost, but the Zinther would be regrouping. They had the resources, the soldiers, and the machinery of war at their disposal. The rebellion, by contrast, had to rely on guerrilla tactics, stealth, and the willpower of those who had joined the cause. There was no doubt in Zalara's mind. This would be a long and bloody war. But she had no intention of losing. Not now. Not when the stakes were so high. "We have an opportunity," Zalara said, her voice steady and filled with purpose. "The Zinther will be looking to strike at our weaknesses. We need to anticipate their moves. We need to hit them where it hurts." Her plan was bold, perhaps too bold. But in her heart, Zalara knew it was the only way forward. She would take the fight directly to the heart of the Zinther Empire, striking at their most vital systems, their most powerful strongholds. If the rebellion could cripple the Empire's core, the rest of the galaxy would have a chance at freedom. "I propose we hit the Empire's supply lines," Zalara continued. "Their war machines rely on constant resupply. If we cut off their resources, we can slow them down, weaken them." Dorian raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by the idea. "Cutting off their supply lines will force them to divert their forces, split their attention." "Could work, but it's dangerous." "It is," Zalara acknowledged. "But it's also our best shot at dealing them a crippling blow. We need to make the Zinther fight on multiple fronts." The plan was daring, but the rebels had no other choice. The Zinther had been unopposed for so long that their empire had become bloated, vulnerable in ways they did not yet realize. By the time they understood the depth of the rebellion's reach, it might already be too late. Zalara gave the order, and within days the rebel fleet had mobilized. Ships were dispatched to key locations across the galaxy, pirate-controlled systems, industrial planets, and previously neutral worlds that had come under Zinther influence. Each was carefully chosen for its strategic value. The rebel forces would strike swiftly, disabling key infrastructure and sowing chaos among the Empire's ranks. They would cripple the Zinther's ability to resupply and reinforce, cutting off their ability to wage war effectively. The first wave of attacks hit hard, with rebel forces raiding supply depots and attacking convoys, making it impossible for the Zinther to bring in reinforcements or materials. Zalara's forces moved quickly and decisively, using hit-and-run tactics to cripple the Empire's war machine from within. It was a risky gambit, but the results were undeniable. The Zinther were scrambling to respond, their once efficient systems faltering. But the Zinther were not idle. As expected, their retaliation came swiftly and violently. The Empire launched a series of counterattacks, sending their elite shock troops to reclaim lost territory. Their fleets, now better organized and reinforced, descended upon the rebel forces with renewed intensity. The galaxy was now a battleground, and the stakes had never been higher. Zalara's forces had to remain mobile, always staying one step ahead of the Zinther's wrath. The days of isolated skirmishes were over. Every engagement now carried the weight of an entire rebellion's survival. One such battle took place on the moon of a gas giant, where a critical rebel stronghold was located. The Zinther had learned from their previous defeats and now deployed their most formidable warships. The rebels, vastly outnumbered, were forced to use every advantage at their disposal, terrain, speed, and surprise. Zalara stood at the helm of the rebel flagship, watching as the battlefield unfolded before her. The Zinther warships were closing in, their weapons primed and ready. The rebel ships were smaller, faster, and more agile, but they could not outgun the Zinther in direct combat. "We need to make them think we're retreating," Zalara said to Dorian, her voice firm. "Draw them in, and then we hit them from behind." Dorian nodded. "Understood. This is going to be close." The rebel ships feigned retreat, pulling back into the moon's shadow, leaving the Zinther fleet to believe they had won the day. The Zinther, eager for a decisive victory, pursued the retreating ships, only to find themselves ensnared in a trap. The rebels struck from behind, launching a surprise counterattack, flanking the Zinther and forcing them into disarray. It was a hard-fought battle, but the rebels emerged victorious once again. The Zinther fleet was left in tatters, their commanders stunned by the audacity and cunning of Zalara's forces. The victory sent shockwaves through the Empire. Zalara had not only survived their retaliation, she had struck back harder than ever before. In the aftermath of the battle, Zalara stood on the bridge, gazing out at the wreckage of the Zinther ships. She knew this was only one of many victories, but it was an important one. The Zinther were not invincible. They were vulnerable, and the rebellion, against all odds, was proving to be the galaxy's most formidable threat. Zalara had always been a strategist. Every move, every decision was calculated with precision, but even the most careful plans could falter in the chaos of war. The Zinther Empire, despite the setbacks they had endured, was a beast with many heads. The rebellion's victories were beginning to take their toll, but Zalara could feel the storm clouds of retaliation gathering on the horizon. After the successful raid on the moon base, Zalara's fleet had taken refuge in an asteroid belt, hidden away from the watchful eyes of the Zinther. The rebels needed a brief respite, time to regroup, repair their ships, and plan their next move. The victory had been hard-won, but it had proven one thing: the Zinther were not invincible. They were vulnerable, and the galaxy was now looking to Zalara for leadership. Her allies, once scattered and divided, had come together under her banner. The Harnack, the Kavari, the humans, each species had given their all to the cause. Zalara stood as a unifying force, a symbol of hope for the oppressed. Yet as the days passed, she began to feel the weight of responsibility more acutely. The rebellion was not just a military campaign. It was a movement that had the potential to reshape the entire galaxy. And with that came the heavy burden of leadership. "We've done well, but we're not out of the woods yet," Dorian said, breaking her train of thought. He stood beside her in the dimly lit command room, the soft hum of the ship's engines vibrating beneath their feet. "The Zinther will regroup. They'll come at us harder next time. We need to be ready." Zalara nodded, her gaze fixed on the holographic map of the galaxy. The Zinther were everywhere, their fleets spanning across hundreds of star systems. While the rebels had struck a significant blow, they were still far from being able to overthrow the Empire. But Zalara had learned something vital in the past few months. The Zinther, for all their power, were not as organized as they appeared. Their vast empire had bred complacency, and now they were struggling to adapt to the unpredictability of the rebellion. "We'll hit them where they least expect it," Zalara said, her voice firm. "But we'll need to move fast and strike deep into their territory. We can't afford to let them consolidate their strength." Dorian's eyes narrowed. "You're talking about a direct strike at the heart of their empire. It's risky. The Zinther will throw everything they have at us." "I know," Zalara replied, "but the longer we wait, the stronger they'll become. We've proven they can be beaten, but we can't give them time to recover. We'll cripple their command structure, cut off their leadership. If we can take out their central command, we can force them into disarray." The plan was ambitious, but Zalara had always been one to take risks. The Zinther had the strength of numbers, but the rebels had something far more valuable: the element of surprise. If they struck swiftly and decisively, they could strike a blow to the heart of the Empire. As the fleet prepared for the mission, the tension aboard the flagship was palpable. Every officer, Every fighter knew what was at stake. This was not just another raid. This was a war-winning strike that could cripple the Zinthers' ability to command their forces across the galaxy. If they succeeded, the rebellion would be one step closer to victory. If they failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. Zalara gathered her commanders in the war room, her eyes scanning each of them. The faces before her were a mix of determination and unease. She knew they were all aware of the risks, but they were also aware of the stakes. They were ready. "We've located the Zinther Command Center," Zalara began. "It's located on a heavily fortified planet, surrounded by a fleet of warships. The Zinther think their command center is untouchable. We'll show them they're wrong." She outlined the plan in detail. The rebellion's fleet would strike swiftly, using their smaller ships to infiltrate the enemy's defenses, targeting weak points in the planet's infrastructure. The goal was to capture or destroy the central command node. A single successful strike could cripple the Empire's ability to coordinate its vast armies, turning the tide of the war in the rebels' favor. The room was silent for a moment before Dorian spoke up. "What happens if we fail?" Zalara's gaze hardened. "We don't fail. We can't afford to." The next few hours were a blur of activity as the fleet prepared for their most daring mission yet. Zalara could feel the weight of every decision, the lives of thousands resting on her shoulders. She had never been one to shy away from a fight, but this was different. This was more than just a battle. This was the opportunity to alter the course of history. As the rebel ships slipped out of the asteroid belt and made their way toward the Zinther stronghold, Zalara couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into the jaws of the Empire. The Zinther were waiting. She could sense it, but they would not be ready for what was coming. The rebel fleet entered the system, and immediately the Zinther forces reacted. Ships surged forward, forming a blockade around the planet. The rebels had no choice but to engage, drawing the Zinthers' attention away from the real objective. The battle that ensued was fierce. The Zinther fleet was larger, better equipped, and more heavily armed, but the rebels had the advantage of speed and unpredictability. Zalara's fleet darted in and out of the enemy formations, striking with surgical precision, disabling the Zinther ships one by one. In the midst of the chaos, Zalara's flagship broke through the blockade, heading toward the planet's surface. Her target was clear, the command center deep within the heart of the planet. It was a dangerous mission, one that could cost them everything. But Zalara was not one to back down. She had come too far to fail now. The surface of the planet was a maze of trenches, fortresses, and anti-air defenses. The Zinther had made sure that their command center was nearly impenetrable. But Zalara had anticipated this. The rebels were ready for whatever the Zinther could throw at them. As they descended toward the surface, a wave of missiles fired from the planet's surface, attempting to destroy the rebel ships before they could land. Zalara's heart raced as the flagship weaved through the barrage of missiles, its engines flaring as it sped toward its objective. She had one shot and she wouldn't waste it. They landed near the command center, and the battle moved to the ground. Rebel forces stormed the complex, engaging Zinther troops in fierce combat. The corridors of the command center were filled with the sounds of gunfire and explosions. Zalara led the charge, her blade cutting down enemy soldiers as they fought their way toward the heart of the complex. Finally, they reached the control room. The Zinther commander, a towering figure in silver armor, stood ready to defend his post. Zalara met his gaze, and for a brief moment, the two locked eyes. He had been one of the Zinther's greatest leaders, but now, standing before him, Zalara saw only the remnants of an empire on the verge of collapse. With a swift motion, Zalara's blade cut through the air, and the Zinther commander fell to the ground. His death sent shockwaves through the command center, and the Zinther forces began to disband in confusion. The rebels had won. As Zalara stood over the commander's body, she knew this was not just a victory. This was the beginning of the end for the Zinther Empire. The Zinther command center was in ruins. Smoke billowed from shattered walls, and the air was thick with the scent of burning metal and ozone. Rebel soldiers had taken control, securing the complex and pushing the Zinther forces into retreat. Zalara stood in the heart of the devastation, her breathing steady, but her mind still racing. The final blow to the Empire had been struck. Their central command was in disarray, their leadership crippled. The Galactic War had shifted irreparably in favor of the rebellion. But even in this moment of victory, Zalara knew it was not over. The war might have been won on this battlefield, but the fight for the galaxy's soul was only just beginning. She glanced over at Dorian, his face covered in the grime of battle but his eyes alight with pride. He nodded, offering a rare smile. "We've done it," he said, his voice hoarse from the combat, but there was a quiet satisfaction in his tone. "We've done part of it," Zalara replied, her gaze sweeping over the remains of the command center. "But the galaxy is still full of Zinther loyalists, and the systems they control are still in chaos. We need to stabilize, or the victory will be hollow." She turned toward the communication console, where her officers were already working to send word to the fleet. The news of their success would spread like wildfire, but it was not enough to simply win the battle. They needed to consolidate their gains before the Zinther could muster another counterattack. "We've taken the heart of their command," Zalara continued, addressing her commanders who had gathered in the room. "But we're not just here to break their chains. We're here to build something new, something that can never be undone." The rebellion's victory was not just military. It was ideological. Zalara's leadership had shown the galaxy that unity could overcome oppression, that the Zinther's might was not absolute. The rebellion's victory over the Empire's core would send a message to every corner of the galaxy. Oppression would not be tolerated. The Zinther had been the architects of a galactic nightmare, but they were not invincible. Her message was simple, but it carried the weight of everything they had fought for. "We're not just breaking an empire. We're uniting the galaxy, under a banner of freedom, of choice, of life. We will restore what the Zinther took." As the message was broadcast across the galaxy, a wave of hope spread through the systems that had long been under the Zinther's iron grip. Rebel cells from the farthest reaches of the galaxy responded. Planetary governors, once puppets of the Zinther, now pledged their loyalty to the rebellion's cause. Even the Harnack, once skeptical of human involvement, began to see the truth of Zalara's vision. They had fought beside her and witnessed her resolve. They knew she would not fail them. But the Zinther were not finished. In their desperation, their remaining loyalists rallied their forces, retreating to hidden strongholds across the galaxy. They were weakened, fractured, but they were not broken. Their leaders, now operating in the shadows, would fight to maintain control of what remained of their empire. The Zinther Empire would not surrender quietly. They would force Zalara and her allies to fight for every inch of territory, every star system. The question now was, could the rebellion survive long enough to finish what they had started? The following weeks were filled with diplomatic maneuvering as Zalara's forces sought to unite the galaxy. The rebel fleet was bolstered by new allies from previously neutral worlds, while the remaining Zinther strongholds became their targets. It was a war of attrition now. Each victory gave the rebels a new foothold, but the Zinther loyalists dug in deeper, making every conquest a costly one. Zalara's forces struck relentlessly, using their superior tactics and knowledge of the Zinther's weaknesses to outmaneuver them. One by one, Zinther strongholds fell. The empire was crumbling, but it was not going down without a fight. Every major battle that the rebels won left the galaxy a little freer, but the cost of each victory weighed heavily on Zalara's mind. On the front lines of one such battle, Zalara stood alongside Dorian, watching as her forces fought with the determination of those who knew they were on the cusp of reshaping the galaxy. The Zinther had been forced back from a major industrial planet, but there were still pockets of resistance. The war was far from over, and Zalara knew she could not afford to let her guard down now. "You're still carrying the weight of the galaxy, aren't you?" Dorian asked, his voice low as he stood next to her. Zalara sighed, glancing over the battlefield. "I never expected it to be easy," she said, "but I also never imagined that we'd be fighting a war on so many fronts. The rebellion is growing, but it's fragile. Every victory brings us closer to our goal, but it also means more lives at stake." "We'll get through it," Dorian replied. "The people you've united, they'll fight for this cause until the end." Zalara met his gaze, Her eyes filled with a mixture of resolve and exhaustion. "I hope you're right," she said, "but we can't just fight for victory. We need to build something that lasts." The rebellion was not just a battle against the Zinther, it was a fight for the future of the galaxy. Zalara knew that a post-Zinther galaxy would need to be rebuilt from the ground up. There would be no easy peace, no simple solution. The galaxy had been scarred by years of war, oppression, and exploitation. Healing those wounds would take time, and there would be challenges at every turn. As the final battles raged and the Zinther began to fade from the galaxy's power structures, Zalara began to consider what came next. She would need to lead not just in battle, but in reconstruction. Unity would not be easy to achieve. Old divisions would need to be healed, and new systems of governance would need to be put in place. The rebellion's victory was only the first step in a much larger journey. The galaxy was fractured, but it was also full of potential. The galaxy needed not just a new leader, but a new way forward, a way of cooperation, of peace built from the ashes of war. The end. Thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stellar HFY content. Ring that bell to stay updated, and we'll see you next time.